So welcome to this morning's Dharma time. We're going to be talking about the causes of suffering, which I feel unethical talking about without also including the sources of joy. If we only speak to the causes of suffering, we might feel sort of morose at the end of our discussion. So I will include the sources of joy, and we'll look into those sources and how we can access them. To start, we will just have a period of quiet together. So you can rest your hands in your lap. Let your eyes close. And to support your mind as well as your body to drop into stillness, bring your thinking mind, also sometimes called your habit mind, bring it down into the connection you're having right now with your hands, wherever your hands happen to be resting, and whatever experience your hands are having. You can think of the narrowing of the aperture of a camera to one specific focus. And right now, that's simply hands, fingers, and thumbs. And if your mind is relatively bouncy this morning and doesn't stay with the hands, but keeps leaping off into other thoughts, you might specifically use your exhale to direct your attention down and into hands, fingers, and thumbs. There are sensations happening there, and they will also be ever fresh. So even if you pay attention one moment, the next moment can still be a fresh experience. Without any need to say which sensations you like or don't like, or to even evaluate as good or bad sensations at all, keep your mind at rest on your hands, fingers, and thumbs. And with appreciation for the anchor that your hands are providing, your mind, join your hands in Anjali Mudra. And with appreciation that each other has come today, and we get to practice and discuss in a group, with your next exhale, you may bow your head to your heart. And release your hands and open your eyes. It's really quite exciting that we have the luxury of time just to discuss these matters and to be together to have the discussion. So thanks for being here, and for being here in a wholehearted way as we discuss the topic of suffering, which most of us have had some taste of, greater or lesser degrees of, more ongoingly, more intermittently, but it's not a comfortable condition for the human being. And yet, as we've heard in Buddhism, the first principle is suffering exists. And one of the second things said in Buddhism is everything is fleeting and temporary and impermanent, and amplifies the feeling of suffering. I was giving a discussion in Wasilla, Alaska, a week ago Thursday, on yoga and neuroscience. And we were talking about how cognition comes on board at a certain age in our development, but the awareness that you're temporary, and so too are your parents and your siblings and your dog and your cat, the awareness of that temporary, finite nature doesn't come on board immediately when you have cognition. What a blessing. It's not like the first thing you realize at 2 or 3 years old, like it's all temporary and it's all going to pass and someday my parents will die. You don't know that at 2 or 3, but you start knowing that if a life event occurs in your family system, like it did in my family when my grandfather died when I was 8, but a pet died before that, which was very confusing for my little brain to understand where the pet had gone. So as you become aware of life's impermanence, at first it may seem frightening, uneasy-making, disquieting, depending on how your family culture, your community culture, and the larger culture celebrate, hold space for, or acknowledge that, or how they don't. And at a certain point, that awareness of the temporary nature hopefully produces a response of preciousness and cherishing of what is in the here and now. Rather than, as the mind is inclined to, grasping for what we enjoy to last, and already mourning its loss when we know it's temporary. So then we're in the future and not in the now. Or having the sense that it's all temporary and therefore you sort of blow it off or dismiss it. Last night we were discussing attachment styles, and the likelihood is that the insecure attachment style grasps for this thing to last and already mourns its loss before it's happened, anticipates the loss and feels angst about it before there's actually a loss. And the dismissive or avoidant attachment style might have that relationship of, oh, it's all temporary. I let it go. I'm not grasping, I'm not holding on. In fact, I'm not attaching. Do you understand what I mean by that? And in this case, the word attachment refers to our psychological development, not the same meaning of the word attachment in yoga and Buddhism, where we talk about attachment and non-attachment. This word attachment that I'm referring to when we say secure attachment is considered very healthy. It's our human capacity for connection and to stabilize in that connection. So you'll recall that on the dismissive attachment style, a person has learned to navigate the world by caring a little bit less about connection and attachment and backing away from it. And that's a strategy developed in early life that may work at the time, and then we have the joy of outgrowing that strategy, which is accompanied by things like pain and poignancy as well. Because a strategy well formed and defended our lives from us is painful to unthaw. I suppose the word is just thaw. Is that right? Yeah, the word unthaw doesn't exist, I'm told. But you understand my meaning. And the person who developed insecure attachment or anxious attachment style also did that in guarding against the uncertainties or pain or calamities or chaos of life. So that we formed a certain way of attaching to others, and both of those styles lean us into suffering. When we have a sense of the secure base, we navigate the 5 causes of suffering from a much wider view with a great amount of stability. So let's hypothesize that each of us has the capacity for secure attachment. Each of us here and everywhere has that capacity, even if we weren't gifted that in early life, even if we didn't have the most ideal circumstances. And even if our parents didn't, and our parents' parents didn't, and so on, and upstream into generations, even if they didn't, that there's an indwelling capacity for us to come back to secure attachment, and therefore to experience awe, belonging, a sense of our wholeness, our capacity for tenderness, and faith in the unfolding journey that is us. Those happen to be the 5 sources of joy. So that's awe about life and life's impermanence and preciousness. A sense of our belonging, like we have a right to be here, as Desderata said in his passage. You have a right to be here without urgency or haste. You go amidst the noise of life. Don't forget that you belong. Tenderness towards the human condition in all of its manifestations, in us and in others. And a sense of our wholeness as a person, even while we're still unfolding. Like, not a sense of a constant incompleteness or brokenness, but a sense of wholeness. And then faith that it's actually all unfolding as it's best able to. And I'll unpack those a little bit more after I talk about the cause of suffering, but it gives you a preview that there's something hopeful as a process, that we are magnetically drawn to that security and attachment. It takes us waking up to that possibility before the magnetism turns on. Otherwise, if let's say that we're oriented to insecure attachment, anxious, ambivalent attachment, if we had an awareness of the magnetic possibility of secure attachment, it would increase the pain we're living in over here. So that magnetism awakens once we have the possibility of a secure attachment system being available to us, like a therapist or a dear friend or a teacher or a community that can act as that holding container. And then the magnetism says, oh, blip on the radar screen, here's a possibility. Likewise, if you had dismissive or avoidant attachment, we can't tolerate the pain of realizing there's another way to do this when we're in that style, until the other possibility actually becomes available. I've said this in other contexts, like if you were raised in an environment that didn't include broccoli, you wouldn't be able to crave broccoli. It wouldn't exist. So if you were raised without Cheetos, you wouldn't be able to crave Cheetos. It wouldn't be a part of your palate. You wouldn't know to crave that particular substance. And so likewise, you wouldn't be able to crave secure attachment if you had been developed in these other ways. So once the magnetism gets turned on, that's pretty exciting. It's like when I first this might sound like junk food to you, but when I first tasted the Fritos in Mexico, and they were like hot chili and lime. I don't eat Fritos in America, but there we were in Mexico, and you're looking for a snack, and you're in the middle of nowhere, down in Ixcalac at the border of Belize, and there's a little store on the side of the road that looks like a cardboard box, and people actually live in the store. And the treats available, the only recognizable treat was Fritos because of the packaging, and the colors and the logo, and it had a picture of a hot chili and a lime. I was like, well, that'll do. My electrolytes needed the salt anyway, and the citrus, so then I was craving the Fritos with chili and lime, because then I knew they existed. This was decades ago, so now you can see our culture has caught up to changing the flavor on corn chips and potato chips to encompass world flavors. Jalapeno potato chips, for example. So once a craving like that begins, once that magnetism awakens, it's really helpful to know how the causes of suffering exist in our possibility as humans and how we perpetuate those causes. We actively perpetuate without knowing that we're doing it. So from a bird's eye perspective, I want you to have an overarching kind of self-forgiveness mantra about how you might have perpetuated some of these things. Before I unpack these, I want to see if Jay has anything. I felt a thought bubble over your head.
Nothing formed.
Okay. You can just jump in.
Okay.
So the first cause of suffering I was referring to last night, we call it in Sanskrit Avidya. And the letter A at the beginning of this word means the absence of, or the loss of. When we say in yoga, ahimsa, asteya, aparigraha, Avidya, they all start with the letter A. So ahimsa, the absence of violence. Asteya, the absence of stealing. Aparigraha, the absence of grasping. Avidya is the absence of life wisdom. Vidya refers to wisdom. Wisdom about your basic nature and the nature of life. It's the wisdom of realizing the indwelling earnestness or innocence or love, that presence. Some people call it Christ presence or Buddha presence, but it's that in you that was born as that radiance. Like if, I was saying this also last night, when we see infants, and please tell me if you haven't had this experience, I'll sign you up for some one-to-one counseling with Jay. If you haven't had the experience when you see an infant of like, whoa, like awe and adorableness, and it pulls that sense out of you when you're looking into the eyes of a newborn, and their light and bobbling nature encourages you to care for them already. That's programmed into us to care for that little awe bubble that was just born into the world. So the remedy to forgetting your basic nature is coming back to awe. Just like the awe instinct you have for the infant or the kitten or the puppy, you're like, it makes so much joy in your heart to be with a young being that was just born into the world and is so less conditioned than the other members of society. So when we forget our basic nature, we live a distanced relationship to our potential and our earnestness and our innocence. And that's very painful. We also forget the basic nature of others. And then we can, in interpersonal dynamics, we can create conflict. We can judge and condescend and demonize other people. We can triangulate. We can shut somebody out of our hearts by condoning a certain way that we feel and condemning a way that they're behaving. We can create conflict and interpersonal dynamics that are very painful, just coming from forgetting somebody else's basic nature and your own. There's a phrase in India where we say, same but different. Has anybody who's been to India, have you seen that phrase like plastered everywhere, same but different? It's actually used for marketing purposes, but I'm going to use it a little differently here. What I mean by marketing is the stall on this side of the dirt road that sells scarves and the stall on this side of the road that sells scarves are actually selling from the same manufacturer, but they put on their stalls, same but different. They're saying, come shop at my stall because it's better than his stall or her stall. And he's saying the same thing about the other seller. You've seen this, right? And Rishikesh is going to be more intense because we'll be in a really narrow shopping center, little marketplace before we get to the ashram. And so you'll hear it on both sides, and they'll actually be saying it with their item, holding a pashmina. Same but different. You come to see my store. So they're trying to lure you off the path into their little store to buy the same things that the other guy is selling.
And every one of them has the same stuff.
Yeah. But when I say same but different, I'm going to borrow that phrase from India where we could say same, like the same intrinsic source, but different individual expressions of that source. So how something shines through your heart or your body or your life will be unique, like a kaleidoscope has certain gems in it, and you turn it and there's a little image on the inside. But the light through the kaleidoscope, or the light that comes through each of us, that's where we say same. So to remember that is, and to actually grok it, which I think is another word I might have made up, or that comes from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay. Yeah. To remember or grok that is also like looking up at the night sky and realizing it's enormous and our planet is so tiny and we're even smaller than that. And that instigates the feeling of awe, which is like majesty and immensity and expansiveness and the incomprehensibility of this preciousness all at once. Now, to have awe about life is wonderful, and it might be a place where somebody begins. But to also have awe about the fact that you exist is really important, personal ability to cherish your life and yourself. And having a narrative inside that says there's awe about your own existence and your own potential can lessen the likelihood of shame being the constant broadcast. Avidya quickly leads to the possibility of internalizing shame. You forget your basic nature or somebody else's. Shame can do that for you. It can crowd out your ability to remember. It causes forgetfulness of that basic nature. And because shame is intended to help suppress difficulty in the interpersonal emotional world, it does a good job of suppressing but also causing that forgetfulness. So when I teach sometimes my yoga classes, and you'll hear this morning when we go to the yoga asana part of the day, I like to say when we're having a sensory thing like, I know your hands are getting warmer right now, or that your heart rate is settling itself down, like we could have awe about that intrinsic body intelligence doing just that thing. Or if I remind my students that your eyelashes are growing themselves right now, yours are too, by the way, and your fingernails and toenails are growing, and though that might be inconvenient sometimes, you could, I forgot to clip my toenails. Teaching a yoga class, the students are going to see that. I would recommend you don't see any of this like biological phenomena as inconvenient, but rather as a chance for awe. And if there are biological symptoms, a chance to say, here's information. Information about how I might right now be out of balance with that body intelligence. I might be just out of alignment enough that I'm getting a symptom. And this symptom at a low decibel level is easier to manage than a symptom at a high decibel level. But if we deny the low decibel symptoms, they have to become medium decibel symptoms, and then higher and higher decibel symptoms until they're getting our attention. And sometimes that's what we call the life wake-up moment. To practice yoga is to help you cultivate greater sensitivity to all this phenomena in the body, so that you might hear the whisper of a symptom or a misalignment way before it's a medical diagnosis. Does this make sense? So what are some other things you might consider being in awe about yourself? And by awe, I don't mean arrogance. I don't mean like unhelpful or unskillful pride, but what might you just have a daily relationship with awe?
I like to sometimes talk about how we're made up of trillions of cells, which is just like an amazing, mind-blowing number, that our whole self is actually trillions of little tiny cells, and that they die every moment and that they get regenerated every moment.
Yeah. And some of those cells knew they had to be your hair. And some knew they should be your liver. How did they know? Yeah. Thank you, Kate. Somebody else?
Nobody can top Kate's. That was the best one.
That's good.
Good. Well, that your heart is beating.
Yeah. I didn't know how to do that. And there's a rhythm for the heart that's optimal. It's also phenomenal that our brains, as human brains, are regulated by rhythm and synchronicity. There's all kinds of rhythms in the body: craniosacral rhythm, heart rhythm, your blood pressure, your body temperature, but also your rhythm and synchronicity with somebody else. And rhythm and synchronicity with your breathing and your moving, which we do in yoga, right? We're timing the inhale to go with a certain movement. We're timing the exhale to go with a certain movement. We're not using a stopwatch, but we're trying to find that rhythm and synchronicity so you can feel like the harmony that you see in nature, which also has rhythm and synchronicity. Yeah. And what else occurs?
I just always think about the beauty of the mundane. That like this morning and waking up and noticing the angle of the sun coming in my window, and the way oatmeal looks. I mean, really, just basic stuff when I invite myself to notice it.
Yeah, yeah. Many years ago, there were 2 films that came out, and I think by that time I had left Brighton Bush Hot Springs, where we didn't see films on a regular basis at all. I think this is when you rented a VHS and you put it in the machine. And these 2 films came out, and I was talking to my Dharma teacher, who had recommended both of them. Catherine Ingram is her name. And she recommended 2 moments in each of these films that were like that awe about the mundane. Both of the films were really painful drama films, painful family dynamics. One was called American Beauty. The other was called The Ice Storm. Those are pretty hard to watch when I had just seen movies again for the first time. In fact, the first big screen movie I saw after leaving Brighton was the Titanic. I was like sick to my stomach in the movie theater and getting a headache from all the whatever they did to make the special effects. I was like, whoa, I have to get out of this theater. This was in Seaside, Oregon, so when I left the theater, there was an ocean. The movie was about the ocean. It was all kind of a bad situation. I had to recover from that. But watching American Beauty, the moment Catherine told me to look at was when the man was watching either the paper bag or a plastic bag, and it was doing this thing in the wind, and he was mesmerized. Like, for those moments, she was saying, he came into the present moment, awe. And in The Ice Storm, it was when the young boy who was about to be victim to the lightning, he saw the light, the electricity. He was watching it with awe, and he was, for that moment, spared from the pain in his family system. And then, as we saw, he was killed. The natural world was more powerful than he was. But you can feel in the movie how even the producers set those moments up to say, let's remember. And so it's similar to the oatmeal and the sun rising, right? Yeah. So how do we cultivate ourselves to spend more time in awe and less time in forgetfulness, less time in avidya?
Come to the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
Stay present.
Yeah. What might be some tangible rituals that you can set up for that present moment?
Well, mine is to say, come to the present moment.
Great. Good.
And I have to do that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But it really works for me because suffering really just dissipates in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm attracted to it a lot more now that I realize how easily I can
You can come back.
come back to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is actually just the words for me.
Yeah.
But I do teach, earth temperature of the room on your skin, soften your skin and your muscles,
Yeah.
loosen your muscles when you're gone. So when I'm teaching, I'm not expecting to say, really do that. But I have to.
But you're giving them cues to land on, and that's a really helpful thing. Is like, where are we going to park the attention? How effective was it to have hands and thumbs when we sat at the beginning of this time together?
It was very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
For me.
Yeah, relatively effective for some and more effective for others.
That's the wielding of the attention. That's
Yeah.
the fundamental thing. The way I look at it is that attention, I call attention the master function, because everything is a product of that somehow. And that all of those activities do the same thing. That it kind of doesn't matter what it is you're talking about, as long as your brain is getting used to the idea of actually wielding your attention instead of just being a monkey mind, as Buddhism calls it. That it's just always reacting, and that the wielding of your attention on anything contributes to the state and the familiarity with it. So that this conditioning 2 times 2, like anything that we do, it just gets built in there, and it becomes easier to get to. I can just think about when I'm sitting to do meditation, and I'm already, if I had brainwave scans on there, I'm sure it would be moving in that direction, just thinking about, just anticipating it. And then sitting, it's going further into it. Before I've even started, it's already starting. And of course that's true of everything that's overlearned. So before you've even started, you're already on whatever track it is. If you start out thinking or feeling or anticipating something stressful, you're already doing it. It can be hours before the thing even, but you're already on that track.
Likewise with the thought about a substance, activity, or self-medicating opportunity. Even the image of cookie, is already your brain is lighting up, if that's one of your go-tos, for example. You're going to say something, Michelle?
Well, when I was first starting to nurse and having a hard time with latching, and this was my third child, and I was thinking I should get this right, and already knowing it was time to feed and feeling how my system was changing even before I had the baby to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We had a similar experience with my son.
Yeah.
It just, and the stress of it was enough to make it even harder.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, because the narrative gets going, and that can hijack the whole system. That's how powerful your mind is. It tells the narrative that it learned to tell, and it tells the narrative that includes fear, like I was talking about last night. On the biological imperative, fear is a big system there, fight, flight, freeze, submit reactions. The narrative is already underway. Where do we get to take ourselves out of that hijack back to the present moment? Actually, anywhere in the spectrum. But most optimally, that we have on a daily basis the chance to rewire how our brains, minds, bodies, and hearts are working together. So a couple recommendations that I'd like to make, and I'm going to combine what Nicole and others were saying there about come back to the moment, appreciate the mundane, wield your attention. I like to encourage awe to be about an intrapersonal biological event, like the trillions of cells, but something also that we can have tangibility with, because I want to increase people's sense of appreciation about their body. Since we live in a culture that doesn't appreciate the body that much, or lives from the neck up, or denies the body too often. So simple things like realizing fingernails and toenails and hair and such, but also any moment where you become aware there's hunger, like to say, oh, and this is the nature of life. Life has hunger. Animals in the form of humans and dogs and cats and fish and spiders and trees and plants. And all of that keeps sustaining life and is sustained by life. So that if we remember this about hunger, it's personal, deeply personal, but it's also universal. So it can break the spell of isolation or negativity in relationship to one's own sense of hunger. I'm someone who was raised in an environment where my appetite was considered problematic for my parents. They didn't really know how to feed us. They didn't have a good system. My mother wasn't well mothered, so she didn't have a good mothering system, and my father came home from the Vietnam War and couldn't tolerate small children who were noisy and chaotic, and that's just being an average child. I'm not saying that we were extra noisy or extra chaotic. It's just that his brain was very uneasy around small beings. And so for me, hunger wasn't something that I could appreciate. It was something that was wrong, bad, and inconvenient. And I certainly felt like it was a problem. I wouldn't have said that about our cats and dogs who needed to be fed. I didn't say it about our fish in the tank. We knew how to feed the fish, and sometimes we overfed them because it was fun to feed the fish and see what they did to go to the surface of the water and do their fish thing. My dad was really big on fish tanks, and we had enormous fish tanks to watch the fish in. So I never had a relationship to the other creatures' appetites as wrong or bad, but my own was. And so to come back to something basic like that, fundamental to our existence, that also connects us to a larger circle of life, that can help reawaken awe in relationship to us. As well as, because avidya tends to isolate us into our own narrative, if you get into the shower in the morning and it becomes hot, you could say, wow, and hot water has been made available. This is incredible. And it's a privilege. It's not true on the whole planet. Not everybody has a hot shower in the morning, and some people don't have enough water for a shower on a daily basis. So we might feel the hot water, and if you're someone who... We have a shower and a bathtub. I love taking a bath. Poor Poquito has to get in the bathtub now for his baths, and I'm in there with him. It's quite an event. But the whole process that we actually have hot water and a container for the hot water, and we have city plumbing, and we have a drain that conveniently goes where it needs to go here in the city. We're not cleaning up that big mess every time. We aren't having to go heat the water on the kitchen stove. It's so elegant and available and accessible. And there we are. Take a few moments of really deep appreciation for the hot water on your skin and come into awe about availability and accessibility and your interdependence. You can also do that as you drive your car on a city street or get onto a city bus. That these things, we live in the city here, so these things have been provided. And here we are. Somebody maintains the traffic light. We can have awe about that. And those little connectors lessen the isolation and deepen our ability for appreciation, which is on that spectrum that gradually becomes sustained awe. Does this make sense to you guys? There's other ways you can do it too, but I like these really tangible ones. For someone who doesn't get to have a hot shower on a daily basis, one of the things I've seen in all my travels around the world is that people like a hot beverage, and they found a way to do it. And so even holding a hot tea mug, just having the hot beverage, wherever that happens to be. In India, they have these little disposable cups. They make them. They're terracotta, is that right?
They're just clay.
Just little clay cups. So if you're getting the chai on the side of the road, they don't reuse paper cups, and they're not tossing out paper in this case. They make these little terracotta, or what did you say, clay cups. And so you get the chai in a tiny vessel. It's not as satisfying as one of the tea mugs we have here at the studio, but it's satisfying in its own way. There it is. The same sensation of hot tea mug at home, but I'm away in India in a foreign land, and it's filthy and polluted, and the chai is delicious.
The chai was cooked in a 35-year-old pot over a cow dung fire on the side of the road.
Right. And the lady she's squatting like this, wearing a beautiful sari, and shaving actual ginger, like fresh ginger, into her chai. She was our favorite chai maker because she used the fresh ginger right there on the spot as she was doing it. And all around her is chaos and filth and like cow hooves going by, and she's working the chai like this. You can't help but be mesmerized by the simple awe of that. And if you hooked it up at home, that your hands remember hot tea mug, you can take it anywhere with you on the planet. But even if you don't get a hot shower, you have some tangible meditative remembrance. Yes?
I think about photography is such a good way of bringing yourself back to awe, and anyone can do it now because most people have a smartphone and most people are taking pictures, and every day it's like I have that perfect picture of my baby like right before he starts screaming and like it may seem like a fake representation of life to be like, look at this beautiful picture, but it's really more like this is more the true nature of what I want to live in. And yes, it was surrounded by all this chaos, but but this happened too.
Yeah, and this is a skillful use of memory. Memory, the word memory in Sanskrit is smriti, and it means memory as well as the constant remembrance that you're on the path of yoga. And to use memory in that way where you can imagine your brain lighting up with joy and love is a positive way to use memory. Because you're also saying there's a reality that this image is of a time he's already outgrown. You're not saying, and now the baby's fixed to be this age and this temperament and this facial expression always. I don't hear you collapsing around that. That can be a positive use of memory. Yeah. So what happens if we've succumbed to avidya, that is the first cause of suffering, is that we immediately are moved to the next cause of suffering. Here is called asmita. And this word means ego, or translated as the I maker, like the word I, like I exist, I have these needs, I have these pains and sorrows. Asmita is the I maker. I think of it as the part of us that causes our separateness. Our feeling of isolation begins when we forget, but the story of our separateness is deepened by asmita. And the story of your separateness lets you stay in the narrative that you're fundamentally alone. Or, in that isolation, the narrative of your brokenness, or your flawedness, or your insufficiency or inadequacy, that story gets to be more powerful because it doesn't have something pushing back on it. When we're isolated, it's very hard to push back on negative narratives about ourselves. If you were to tell somebody else the narrative that's most painful to you about you, and if you were to tell it in the actual way that you hear it in your head, they would probably be a lot more kind-hearted and tender towards you than you are about that narrative. So exposing that narrative to somebody else feels very painful, however, because on top of our narrative is also the narrative that nobody else feels like this. And then if we told them, we would risk our experience of belonging or acceptance or connection. So what happens then cultural-wide is that we keep those narratives concealed, and it increases the likelihood that shame isolates us further.
Another thing I've noticed with that with clients over the years is sometimes they'll tell a story and they'll tell it in a fairly, sometimes almost a flat way, like they're just talking about the weather or something, and it's perhaps an old and very sad story, and will bring tears to my eyes, and they're just sitting there. It seems like they could be talking about the weather, and they see my response to it, and it reflects back, and they get back in touch with something that they've distanced from. That you get so used to having it, you develop a tolerance for the presence of this thing, and you can't really learn or grow from something that you don't even notice anymore, or you don't experience anymore. So that mirroring, sharing it, allows you to do something with it.
Yeah, and to have your narrative heard by somebody else who responds so differently, that's really deep medicine. To share your narrative with somebody who reinforces it is unskillful action. You understand what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. And you've probably taken that risk a couple times, maybe more than a couple times. And if you have taken that risk and it was the wrong person at the wrong time and you got a painful outcome, I recommend, as I said last night, mindful curiosity, self-empathy, and then self-forgiveness. Right? You misread the circumstance. It doesn't make you evil or bad or stupid. It means you misread a circumstance. You misread how you could trust another human to respond to your narrative in a more hopeful way. Now, sometimes people have their narrative and they're so fixed on it that if you respond to them with kindness and love and warmth and empathy, they want to convince you out of it. Has anybody here tried that one? I mean, as the person convincing the other human that actually your story is more true than they believe. You tried that? Yeah. How did that go? How did it go for you, Annalise?
I got called on it. Just, made it where what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did it take more than one layer of convincing?
Yeah, because she was coming back to truths and then really right back in the argument.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That's the part that that believes that just constantly argues with myself about it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a kind of resource consumptive argument to have with ourselves in an ongoing way. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I have to say no to the inner arguers because I know there's a biological drain. A person's reserves are getting, like through the spaghetti strainer, drained by that process. Yeah, thank you. Who else has tried it, and would you be willing to say how it turned out? And yes, Jess.
Depends on who I'm doing it with. I've tried that in the past and had people be just give up on me, basically, whatever. Mm-hmm. But then I've also had the experience of having people being like, what? Like being called out, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, similar to what she was saying. They're able to reflect you back more consistently, and maybe even their bafflement is a good intervention.
Yeah.
I don't know how you came to see yourself this way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. This cold breeze that just started from underneath the door, can somebody check the thermostat and what it's doing or saying, please? We haven't quite figured out how the heat in this building works yet. It's got one control for the whole building, but all the rooms are different sizes. Sorry, the thermostat is behind you guys there. So if Asmita causes separateness, the source of joy that helps alleviate that suffering is called belonging, returning to belonging. Now, one of the things that I like to say to my students, I have like this, what I say as a fundamental truth. The evidence that you belong already exists in that here you are. Life has already seen to it that you belong here. Now, of course, shame can tell a very strong story that you don't belong or aren't worthy of belonging or never belonged or you weren't wanted or you were a burden to, and so on and so forth. Shame can really deeply remind you of and reinforce that story. Quite likely, shame right there is acting again as a suppressant, which I was talking about last night. It's suppressing the other more difficult feelings under the surface, those that you wouldn't have a container or a context for, that you couldn't bring your cognition to. But as shame is doing that suppressing thing, and it tells you that you're not worthy of belonging, it deepens the sense of separateness and increases the fear that if somebody found out about our personal shame narrative, it would be cause for annihilation. The phrase in Jay's training field is called tantamount to annihilation. Is that how they say it?
Kind of a famous phrase from psychoanalysis. As they came about that as a way to describe what they posited was the reason that people would invest so much in their neurotic defenses. Even that people would defend against, just say broadly, defend against reality or knowing something or feeling something because to such extremes, even to the death, that they had to posit, wow, this must be a big investment for a person to continue to pursue this in that language, neurotic defense or defense to that level. And so I've used that idea a lot when people will be so vigorously invested in the perspective or the narrative or the particular defense that they have. That there was, when you were talking about that I call that splaining, when people start rationalizing their attachment to their perspective or their whichever method they may be using. That I don't necessarily say that right away, but at some point, usually, once I've got to know a client, I'll come down to the point, you're splaining again. You've already splained that. I'm borrowing that from an old television show. I love Lucy. Lucy, you're splaining. You have some splaining to do.
Yeah. So what are some other ways you might, I'm giving you my fundamental bumper sticker phrase, the evidence that you belong already exists because here you are embodied with the same body intelligence and the same inner indwelling source of earnestness and luminosity that we see on the planet. Here you are, you already exist. So I'm sort of talking a person into their belonging. What are some other ways? I have some more lighter tools than this fundamental reality statement, but what else might you do to help yourself or somebody else remember that fundamental belonging? How do you yourself experience belonging? What are some of the pieces of the context that remind you that you belong?
Can I ask about a challenge I have with belonging? I feel actually, for me, my challenge is more around aversion, I suppose, of feeling like, I don't share the mainstream cultural values. It's very difficult for me to find a place and groups of people that I really feel a connection or a belonging with. Which is probably why I live in Portland. I think a lot of people move to Portland because they're like, that's a place where there's some shared values, and it's really hard to find in a lot of other places. And I know that there's something deeper than that. Like there is a shared human belonging, but it's not fully satisfying to a sense of really being understood or seen until you find the people that really kind of get you.
Yeah.
And that's been a challenge for me.
And that's one of the important ingredients, is that you are able to actively seek out the relationships in which you feel gotten, you feel understood. You're getting and being gotten at the same time, which we sometimes use as a definition of empathy. You're resonant, you're attuned, it's working. And yet what happens is, if that's smaller in numbers, because let's say you have a dozen friends, but there's trillions and billions of people on the planet, you're already outnumbered. You'll always be outnumbered by the people who don't get you compared to the ones who do. And the negativity bias in the brain, which is part of how we're wired, will remember the ways in which we don't belong, and it forgets to relish in and deepen our memory of how we do belong. So, again, smriti, remembering that these relationships exist, or that these moments of attunement exist, that you have a dear friend who gets you, or you have had the experience of being seen or understood. Those are very important things to amplify the real estate in your brain. And there's, on a spectrum, I'm going to take that paint chip and turn it upside down again from last night. So let's say the isolationist and the separateness stories are very dense, and a person doesn't actually have relationality in their life yet. Acknowledgement, authenticity, kind-heartedness, and connection were part of last night's intended discussion, so I'll use them right now. So acknowledgement happens when even a person who has relatively few to no actual personal connections is acknowledging the existence of another human being. Not at their own expense, like, now I'm less than because I acknowledge that person. It can be acknowledging a neutral person. The person who held the door open when you walked into Elephant's Deli. Acknowledging them to yourself, like, person held the door open for me. Well, I matter that much, that somebody held open the door. They didn't shut it when I approached, and they didn't let it slam behind me. They held it open. Or the postman delivered the mail. Well, you can tell me, yeah, it's the postman's job to deliver the mail and yada yada, but the postman delivered your mail. That's a statement that you belong to the community. A mail comes to your home and there is hand-delivered. Acknowledging somebody else in traffic. Like at the blinking light up here, some people are really in a hurry to make it their turn. I'm not that much in a hurry at that blinking light. I'm going to get where I'm going in a few seconds. Isn't going to matter as much as some acknowledgement that I'm going to let you into the flow of traffic. So there you go. I acknowledge your existence. Or you acknowledge my existence. And that gives you a sense that you belong to the larger web of humans who are right now occupying the same real estate on the planet that you are. Yeah.
So my friend Tony and I were talking about, he's like, I let someone in and I didn't get a wave. You know, like, what the heck, you know, or I wave at my neighbors who are driving up the hill and they're just right here, so you can't personalize the response, just know that you've done the acknowledging,
yes.
You've exerted the effort, but there's no expectation of it coming back either.
Right, in fact, this acknowledgement practice isn't about the other person being transformed by your action. The acknowledgement practice is about transforming the story you have of your own separateness. Just like the Brahma Viharas are interpersonal practices, we offer loving kindness to somebody else to free up our own hearts. We don't practice loving kindness to change the other person. That's called attachment in that system.
And then we laugh at ourselves that we're like looking for that, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you do get it sometimes and you don't.
Right.
Well, all these things are evidence that the fundamental, the true foundational aspect of the need for connection. Mm-hmm. That it's even the person who's being ill-tempered and on the freeway or the turns or something like that, it could be interpreted that they're isolated, and in some sense they are, and that's part of their suffering. But in another sense, they're in a hurry because they want to conform to something on the other end of that trip, so to speak, right? They want to be on time, or they want to be thought of a certain way by that group. So even those behaviors at the root of them are about a sense of connection with somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it's, in some sense you could say that's true of everything. Not everything is necessarily an adaptive way to go about it, but I think that it is so fundamental that you can see it in everything.
Yeah. So the practice, like acknowledgement practice, is to help ourselves remember. Now, the next one of those is called authenticity, which is somebody says something to you like, you're at the store and shopping, you're looking for the ghee and you can't find it. Or the coconut milk, or some obscure ingredient, like, God forbid, black cardamom seems obscure in some stores, so it's not in my life. And it is available at Barber World Food, so is ghee and coconut milk. But somebody says to you, can I help you? You say, no, that's okay. Well, actually, yes, you could help me. I don't know where the ghee is. I haven't found the coconut milk. Like, actually being willing to say what's authentic. Somebody says at the cash register, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "Well, you might test drive." "Oh, I could feel better. It was a little rough today." But we don't say it to burden the other person. We say it to have a sense that we're honest with ourselves in talking to somebody else. Because the part of you that wants that authenticity realizes when the other part of you says, "I'm fine," and inside that little part might be jumping up and down to say, "Well, actually, no, you're not. You just told me that we're not fine." In the way you were talking to me just a few minutes ago in this inner dialogue.
That's one of the little exercises that I've used is when you find yourself saying one of those rote things, to say something else. Anything. Just something else. Instead of just going into that mindless thing that isn't going to actually get where you're going or connect with anybody.
Even if somebody says, "How are you doing?" and you say, "I don't know." Because you haven't practiced saying anything other than fine.
Thanks for reminding me to think about it.
Yeah. Something. And then kind-heartedness is a way of making a gesture towards yourself or somebody else that expresses the kindness capable in the human heart. And sometimes that means that you're the one holding the door open for the person who's walking really slowly. And you might have this urge like, "Oh, now I'm getting impatient. Oh, wait a second. Here's a chance for me to be the one who's kind-hearted. They're not walking on my time frame into this door threshold. And I thought this was going to take me less. It was going to cost me less on my time schedule today. It's like 15 seconds. So you're the one looking for the way to express a kind-hearted gesture, to actually make a point of saying to the mailman, "Thank you so much for being out here in the rain or the sun or whatever it is, and for delivering mail, even my junk mail. Thank you for what you're doing." I imagine that many post people feel unseen and unacknowledged. And even when we go to the prison, for example, and you actively acknowledge how the guard is helping you or what their circumstance seems to be, like that's a kind-heartedness that doesn't take much from you. In fact, it gives back to you also, and it gives to somebody else. And it loosens the narrative about your separateness and increases the feeling of belonging. Most of the correctional officers at the institutions where I've been teaching or facilitating, we don't have a lot of commonality in our actual lives. I'm not a game hunter. I'm not a football watcher. I'm not a Molson Golden drinker. I don't lift weights. I don't own a gun. I don't clean my weapons. But there's commonality in our shared humanity underneath that. And a moment of connection that's kind-hearted and easygoing between myself and them, it boosts me as well as the possibility of boosting them. And when you see yourself as capable of that kind of kind-heartedness, it increases your agency, which is a really important part of having a healthy ego, that you can use your agency in a good direction. Yeah, feel free. It's okay.
Well, we had that, I think it was the first time you heard it too, right?
Yeah.
Maya Angelou was
Maya Angelou.
a number of years ago here in town, and one of the quotes that really stood out for us that she had was from a man who had been a slave in Rome. I think it was about 165 A.D.
Yeah, way back.
Yeah, and he had been freed by his owner and subsequently became a very popular playwright. His name was Terence, and the quote that really stood out for us was, "Because I am human, nothing that is human is alien to me." Pondered that. It's a rather profound statement, and it's sort of encompasses everything that she's been talking about. That's I have that ingrained in me.
Yeah.
As one of my little tools. I have a number of different things in my mind that are so deeply ingrained that they just arise routinely now. It's like 2 times 2 thing. Mm-hmm. And I find that very useful. Oh, because I am human, nothing that is human is alien to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's say that we didn't catch ourselves at Avidya or Asmita. By the time you're experiencing separateness and ego, the other 3 causes of suffering happen rapidly and like as a cluster. Unfortunately, you're now in the avalanche. So raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. Raga means desire, which is, in this case, it means the kind of desire that leads to grasping, compulsivity, addiction, future thinking, future clinging to the present moment, if it's desirable, wanting it to last, and kind of holding it, actually limiting the possibility of expansiveness from desire because you're clutching at how desire just manifested. Or you tell the narrative, if this desire gets met, then I'll be okay. If this happens, it will make me feel better. I can come back to goodness or contentedness. And dvesha means hatred. We translate it to mean aversion, like intense dislike of, aversiveness towards other people or towards oneself or towards the present moment. Desire puts us in a place of great clinging and grasping, and aversion puts us in a place of great reactivity against. So then we're on this pendulum between desire and aversion, grasping and reaction, longing, clinging, resisting, pushing away, and that pendulum is very costly to your vitality. And as that pendulum is swinging, we don't get to rest in our sense of wholeness or tenderness. So the remedy for, or the source of joy associated with the hungry ghosts, which is one way we talk about desire, the source of joy from that would be remembering our sense of wholeness, our kind of already completeness. I don't mean that it's fixed. I mean that there's a wholeness about you. This present moment is complete as it is. If it were meant to be somehow different, it would be. You could participate with your agency to make circumstances brighter or more contented or more skillful, but remembering that innate wholeness says, and this is unfolding. This is an ongoing, poetic life. But if we keep coming to life with a sense of not wholeness or not satisfactoriness or never enough, never complete, always broken, we will have the underlying anxiety of that. And you'll keep grasping for things to satisfy or remedy that sense of brokenness. So this is really about seeing the non-broken, the already whole experience. It's like contentment with what actually is. Like how to have a meal come in a restaurant and look at it and say, well, that's smaller than I thought it was going to be. Or, well, it doesn't quite have it's not as beautiful as I was expecting, or it's not as tasty as I thought it was going to be, or it's not quite really what I wanted. How to look at that and experience contentment in spite of it being less than what you wanted. There's a skill in that, to look at it and say, here's what I was offered. Now you can also be an American and say, but I paid for this, and what I paid for needs to be blah blah. And you can get into that particular life skill that demands you get your needs met.
Or pre-force or prefabricate everything that I'm associating with your meal thing, because a friend of mine is, I've had many meals with him, and one thing I noticed right off the bat, and it continued remarkably consistently for years and years, was we would sit down to eat, and the very first thing he would do is, it's just uncanny. I knew exactly what was going to happen. That as soon as the food was set on the table, first thing he did was look for the salt and pepper. He looked for the salt and pepper before he even looked at the food sometimes. He just looked, as soon as it hit the table, it was salt and pepper. And he would get it and he would salt and pepper it before he even tasted it, before he smelled it. He was just pre-forming it. He was coming to it with this notion that it somehow, he wasn't even thinking. It was so automatic. He just was compelled to make it conform to a pre-existing perspective on it. Mm-hmm. And then we had a number of conversations about it, because I like to cook. So I told him, well, it's kind of an insult to the chef that you're presuming that he hasn't prepared it the way he intended it to be prepared, and you don't even know what this other person's offering you, because you've already shaped it in this preconceived notion of what it's supposed to be. And we've had many, he's a psychologist too, so we've had lots and lots of conversations about it. I did modify his eating behavior to some extent.
Didn't he also reach across and take something off your plate first?
No. Oh boy, no. He's definitely that's not him. He's the exact
Okay, is
opposite. You
that-
don't go anywhere near anybody else's plate.
Who is that?
That's a long.
Okay, all right. Somebody else keeps reaching across the table at the other plates
Yeah.
before tasting their own meal
Before
in
even tasting, yeah.
Jay's life experience. So they're like, I'm going to taste yours before I taste mine. But the practice of coming back to wholeness or remembering that innate wholeness is something to reinforce to help soothe the hungry ghosts. I'm not saying you can't also have the life skill of telling the chef that this food is too rare. If you ordered medium rare, I'm not saying you can't send it back and ask for an improvement. I'm saying practice more often contentment and wholeness. Like actually practice it. Practice being content with something that's not quite exquisitely, perfectly how you wanted it to be, to widen your bandwidth for appreciation or acceptance, and remembering the wholeness that you already are too.
And explore it for what it is. I mean, you don't have to like it necessarily, but at least give it a shot. Say, I wouldn't have seasoned it this way. And then make a choice to explore how that might be okay.
Mm-hmm.
How you could be different with your disappointment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes I apply that to the concept of acquired taste. But I've expanded on the notion a little bit, obviously. But for example, I used to not like wine at all, and then talking to people whose opinions I respected, I thought, well, they must have a reason for liking it. I'm going to start paying more attention to that, and so my palate expanded to allow for a different perspective on the wine, the taste of wine, and all the characteristics. And now I like wine.
Yeah.
So I've added that. It didn't cost me anything, and now I have something new to enjoy in the world.
Yeah. So we lessen the habit of discontent and brokenness. And to live with constant discontent, you've probably seen people in your life who appear to have done that for decades. And maybe they're now seniors and the brain is less flexible. And you think, wow, it's actually getting to be a deeper experience. They're like, it seems like as the human system ages, parts of it shrink and parts of it don't. Like the ears and nose seem to be bigger. Have you guys noticed that?
Because they grow. Right? They never stop growing.
We're all going to be experiencing this. So that's sort of like if discontent is your thing, that can increase in your life spectrum, not decrease. We live in a culture that tells us that we have the privilege and luxury of being able to acquire things rather than practicing contentment. And we have a culture so fascinated by this that now, if you're having a wedding and you want to pre-order the weather, you can do it. There's a company that can change the weather pattern over the real estate of which your wedding is going to be happening. They go a few days before and they might move a cloudburst. They actually go up there. This is very expensive, but you can change the weather over the 100 yards or so of wedding that you're going to be having. They don't guarantee it, but you can pay for the best possible outcome. And they are up there with, the machines that they have in the sky to try to move the weather pattern to make it a sunny day for your wedding. It's an exaggeration of a kind of explosion of the human discontent manifesting as now we can control the weather too. So this is not recommended in the spiritual traditions of the world. I'm not recommending it. I'm putting it in opposition to what we practice with wholeness. And Dvesha's remedy, or the remedy for hatred or aversion, is to really practice tenderness. To actually practice it as you'd practice a yoga pose. To deliberately choose tenderness in response to something rather than aversion. The person who annoys you, the personality trait in them or in yourself that gets on your nerves. I'm not saying that you're condoning that personality trait, but that we might offer a few degrees of tenderness towards that aspect of the human condition that is so finely tuned in them that it keeps happening. Or finely tuned in yourself that it keeps manifesting. So your practice of tenderness is to soften your own heart. Not to say that that behavior is your preferred style for somebody or for yourself, but tenderness towards a small being is often far more successful as a brain development than anger or irritation towards a small being. And it's also the case towards ourselves. Tenderness towards an aspect of you that you struggle with loosens your heart and your mind to respond more skillfully. because your brain actually gets wider. Remember last month we were talking about this narrow perspective from here and widening your perspective using the dorsolateral parts of the brain. Tenderness allows for that. And oxytocin and vasopressin come back online. You say, wow, okay, I can respond differently here.
It may not affect the other person. It might be in a car, right? But the idea that, for me, one of the ways I think about it is when somebody's behaving in a way that is broadly unhealthy. One of the things I think is, wow, they are so stuck that they're doing that. And it actually has an upwelling of sadness in me to think, oh, what a life that must be to be so stuck that they're just unconsciously being cruel or thoughtless or whatever the behavior is. But the depth of that stuckness is, but it doesn't mean I like it, of course. It doesn't mean that my feeling about it has any effect on them, but it's a radically different experience than, fuck you. God, yeah. What's wrong with you? That, whatever else.
Yeah, in fact, in this case, I recommend the mantra of loving kindness. You see the other person, you might have a biological reaction like, please don't cut me off in traffic on the freeway. And you get your rush and then you say to that car, or that person in that car, may you and all beings be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. And it changes your neurological, biochemical, mental, and spiritual reaction to them. Or to yourself.
I have another one that is the exact same thing, but another strong association for me. I'm very fond of the movie Matrix. And I think about people being in the Matrix, that the unconsciousness is rampant, obviously, but I think of the unconsciousness as what the Matrix is from that movie. I don't know if everybody's ever seen the movie, but I think it's a really nicely done metaphor for what's going on. So I think, oh wow, they're really stuck in the Matrix.
Yeah. I want to make an announcement because this is my friend Richard. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
He's here today from noon to 2, and there's a sign-up sheet on the front desk. Anybody who's here for yoga therapy training, and or the two of you are also welcome. Anybody who's around and wants a free 15-minute Ayurvedic consultation, the sign-up sheet is on the front desk, and they start at noon. And I organize that time frame with him based on what I know your training schedule to be. So you have my permission to be the 12:15 or the 12 o'clock or the 12:45, as do you guys, permission. And his office is behind Annalise. So let's move to the last of the causes of suffering. It's called abhinivesha. And it literally translates as fear of not going on being. So it's fear of dying. Fear of not going on being. Now, that actually happens to us before we die. We have the fear of not going on being when we experience painful rejection or the possibility of abandonment or annihilation. It's the deep-seated fear that we won't belong to our tribe. And our human animal needs a tribe to survive and to thrive. So abhinivesha is that fear that prompts us to do something from anxiety, to attach, to connect, to belong. And it starts shaping our behaviors. Like I said in early life last night, I was talking about how it can actually cause a kind of betrayal of your basic nature, because you shape for belonging in the fear that you won't get to belong and then go on being. At this stage in the causes of suffering, I put it here on the bottom, it's the 5th cause of suffering. If we practiced awe and belonging and wholeness and tenderness, and still fear emerges, it means it's a very strong residue in your nervous system. And one of the remedies is to come back to faith. And there's 3 kinds of faith talked about in yoga: Shraddha, Mati, Astikya. Shraddha means faith that life is unfolding as it can and as it ought to be, and that you're also unfolding as you can and as you ought to be. And if you look at, with the teachings of yoga, Mati is faith that yoga works. Like you look at it in ancestors, in the yoga tradition, you look at it in somebody else's life and you say, wow, yoga has really changed them in a way that I admire or that I long to experience for myself. So Mati is faith that yoga works, and astikya is faith that yoga could work in your own life, or mindfulness, or love, or compassion, or the teachings of these traditions. So if you start with shraddha, like faith, or the possibility of faith, or as I said last night, the possibility of faith. If you're not yet convinced, try even the possibility of faith that your life is actually unfolding in wisdom and earnestness. And even the pain that you've experienced has been part of the fire or the alchemy. If that's not yet working, then you say mati, faith that something works in people's lives. And then astikya, faith that something could work in my own life if I apply it. And then you come back up here and you say, I'm worthy of applying it too. I belong. And there's an innate wholeness that wants to emerge and express itself. So let me care for this possibility in myself by applying the science of and the teachings of yoga or other traditions that you've seen work in people's lives. Does this make sense? Anything you want to add, Jay? Anything to add, Richard? I met Richard when I moved to Portland in 1998, and I was just learning how to use email. He already knew how to use email. I wrote an email and I said, I want to study Ayurveda. I wrote an email to a person I didn't know, had never met, had no idea, and he wrote me back pretty promptly and said, great, come on over. And that was a moment for me that faith, my life is unfolding as it ought to be. I had just moved to Portland. I called the prison. They said, great, when can you come? I emailed Richard. He said, great, come on over. And doors were opening like that. And I took it as confirmation that, in fact, I should stick with this penniless path. Primarily service and not a financial means to support myself. But there we were. And when I met Richard in person, I was like, yeah, this works. It's worked in Richard's life, and I hope it can work in my life. And so meeting those people and having that reinforced is very, very important. Did you want to say anything about faith and Ayurveda?
Well, when she emailed me, I was just surprised that somebody not only knew what Ayurveda was, but how to spell it. So I wanted to meet this person.
This was 1998, so it was almost 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. There were 3 yoga studios in Portland at that time.
And 2 of them were named by women named Julie. 2 of them were owned by Julies. So there were 3 yoga studios, Julie, and one other. Yeah. So anything anybody would like to say about faith before we have a few minutes of quiet together?
I really appreciate what you just said about replacing yoga with something. Because I was thinking about, I come from a very atheistic family, and so I'm really sensitive to how certain words really trigger, or like my husband was raised by evangelical Christians, and he's really easily triggered by his childhood experience with the word faith. But I think that this makes a lot of sense, that if you can remove, you don't have to be attached to my system.
Yeah.
That faith is valuable just as its own thing, and it doesn't have to be in anyone's system.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I think some systems feel that they own the word faith, and the way that they describe it isn't how yoga intends it. Like when we call it my faith as a noun, yoga means faith as a process, an ongoing process, and it requires a quality of humility and awe and a sense of value that your life wants to unfold in some way in alignment with the Dharma. That would be looking through the lens of yoga, where it's not a noun like I was saying, but we can substitute other words for it, and we want to be, this is a phrase from social justice, we want to be culturally competent in whom we're talking to and why, and the timing of what we're saying also. Yeah. What other comments about faith or quick questions you might have about it? It's hard to have a quick question about faith, I know, but I'm trying to be sensitive to the timing with them and with us.
I think my mind kind of argues with it a little bit. It's like fear of death, and faith that things are working out as it should, or as it ought to be. And it seems like things could work out a million different ways. It's not like, and things could be terrible, and then say, well, this is how it ought to be. How it ought
This is a great question.
Ought to unfold. I could say that for every single possibility.
Yeah.
And then maybe, it's just random or whatever, it's meaningless or whatever.
I wouldn't go to that, actually, but here's two things I can say. I'm so glad for your question. The fear of death that's happening every day is the fear of not being seen, heard, valued, understood, connected. It's those fears that will be misunderstood or misperceived or shunned. So fear of death of the body, that's big, but fear of not going on being is happening every day, all the time. We can put that in check in some ways by practicing and cultivating the other qualities and brain states and body states here. Now, we will die, and to live in relationship to that truth more wisely now makes that dying process more elegant, as we've also seen or heard from when great spiritual teachers are facing their death, and they know it. And their followers celebrate their presence has been here, and it goes on after their physical body dies. So that's really important to think of it as like a daily thing that we face, fear of being shunned, fear of being forgotten, being rejected. So faith that we're unfolding in a skillful manner is a remedy to that fear, that today I'm going to be rejected. Well, today I'm cultivating greater skill and heart, and I'm applying the teachings of yoga, and I'm going to see the alchemy show up in my life at some point, hopefully a little bit today. And I remember to see how that is today, not to see how it's not in such great quantity. So let the evidence take up more real estate in your brain. The second thing is how things are, we say, is how they ought to be, based on the conditions that existed before this moment. I'm not even talking about blame in any way. It's just that based on these conditions, how this plant grew in the garden is how it ought to have grown. So based on these conditions, which are so varied in the human experience, how this person manifests at this moment is how they ought to be manifesting. Based on, let's say, misattuned parenting, shame, a family system of addiction, naivete or poor schooling or lack of funding for health care, based on those conditions, this person's quandary is what ought to be happening. But the fact that this person is now in this present moment with us also ought to be happening. Are we the catalyst for something to change in their life? This is not looking at how it's going to be determined, but how it's been conditioned to this moment.
So
what's going to unfold
like
next? We get to
translate it as should. It's not really what you're talking about, though, right?
I'm saying
It's
ought.
to is in the sense of cause and effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I say ought to, did I say should?
No, but it's,
Okay.
I think that phrase can be interpreted as things are unfolding as they ought to. So it could be as the way they should.
No.
This is the right way, but there's so many things that aren't. I think that's kind of what you were getting at, right? That, and that it's just that this is the way they're supposed to. Maybe one way of thinking about it, refine that, is that things are unfolding in the way that they are because that's the nature of the conditions.
Yeah.
And I have faith that the way I'm conducting myself will ultimately lead to, and isn't in the moment, the manifestation of that which I want it to be.
Yeah.
So the faith in the process of what we're doing is something that is on the path that we want to be, as opposed to so we've talked about this before, that ought to has that other connotation.
That's what I was kind of struggling with, is I was interpreting it that way when I'm thinking of a circumstance of suffering that is beyond my control and trying to get to a faith place and overcome fear. To me, I struggle because I try to get to acceptance of believing this is sort of the way things are supposed to occur, and I need to accept it even though it may feel unjust or wrong or just really not the right time, even knowing that something is not, there is this impermanence. And so I've precisely struggled with this issue this week, and reframing it in that way, I think, makes it a little bit more palatable for me, because I feel like when there's this deep sorrow of something that
Yeah.
doesn't translate or make sense, I try to get to that faith place, but it doesn't feel authentic and it feels kind of forced and it doesn't even make sense. And I can't arrive there if my head hasn't
That's right.
caught up with it.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's say we probably all agree we don't want children starving anywhere on the planet. And yet if we look at some of the circumstances on the planet, the ecology and the overcrowding and the access to resources, and like a village lives here but the water source is like 10 miles over there, and we think children also should be going to school, but the girls have to go pick up the water and come back to the village. That's what they do all day. They don't get to go to school. We say this is not the right circumstance. But if we pan back and say, based on history and resources and ecology and human crowding, these are the conditions that produced this. And so based on cause and effect, that's how it ought to be showing up. What can we now do about it in our relationship to it? How can we contribute, participate, or be a catalyst for change? Rather than another addition to the suffering. So faith is, now if I apply the teachings of yoga to what I see as this outcome, how am I going to go forward from here? Without clinging to or resenting the past, without demonizing the people who contributed to that particular suffering on the planet.
Or feeling hopeless.
Feeling hopeless, right. Which is at the bottom of that spectrum I talked about last night, from anger down to helplessness and hopelessness. Yeah, so applying a little faith that if I'm hopeless, I might do nothing. If I feel helpless, I might do nothing. But if I say, I wonder if I could apply a little yoga to this moment and possibly make a difference. Because we've all added to the conditioned outcome of this moment together at a meta level on the planet. I don't want children starving anywhere, having loss of access to education or community or medicine, but it's happening in too big a number for my heart. So what can I do to make a difference? That's the next question. Not, it shouldn't be happening, I'm going to damn the history that made it happen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And Jay?
Those guys are getting ready to...
Okay. Did you have a closing comment on what I was just saying there?
That was it. It's just that was the point that we talked about. Like in common usage, like last night I mentioned that the common usage, the word pity is treated as functionally as being almost the opposite of what it actually means. So in onto ends up producing exactly what you were talking about. Yeah, and it's just a turning, just a pointing your attention a little bit over.
Yeah.
I think it makes it livable.
I think with belonging too, it has that fitting in, which is kind of what Kate kind of alluded to, like that fitting in, but it's not what it actually is.
Hi guys. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Looking at that, even so, there, abhinivesha might be fear of not fitting in. So if you establish your sense of belonging, you start to remedy one of the ways this fear shows up. Or if we establish our sense of wholeness, we can remedy the way that our fear of being constantly broken and inept and unable to make a difference, we remedy some of that fear. Or if we come to tenderness, we might lessen the fear of being overwhelmed by such painful life circumstances here and everywhere. So these are like stepping stones to get to. I don't say start here because it's a big thing to start with, but cultivate the brain through these things that arise at the possibility of faith. Oh no, it's okay. Please come.